Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name's Olivia Petter. I am a journalist and author, and I am thrilled to be here today with the brilliant Emma-Louise Boynton to discuss her book, Pleasure, The Reclamation of My Body. So for those who may not know, Emma is the host of the award-winning live event series and podcast Sex Talks, a platform that has facilitated open and honest conversations about everything from the orgasm gap and body image to masculinity and the politics of intimacy in the modern world. Emma covers these subjects and more in her debut book, which blends memoir, social commentary, and interviews, culminating in a powerful call to arms to reclaim female pleasure. So let's explain a little bit about the anonymous Q&A that we're going to do at the end, so you guys have some time to write some questions while we speak.
Well, this is so weird because I'm usually the interviewer. So being interviewed is like, I'm like, whoa, I am not in the position of control and power, but you're such a great interviewer that I know I'm in safe hands. So just for context, at Sex Talks, I always do an anonymous Q&A because I feel like we all have so many burning questions around sex, intimacy, desire, pleasure, and there are so few places and spaces in which we actually get to open and air those questions. And the veil of anonymity generally proves a very encouraging thing to get people asking those deep and juicy questions. So please do ask away. Try and write down those questions as we speak, because we are going to be like, we've got a very tight schedule planned. So we thought I'd begin with a quick reading of the book, just to give you a little bit of a kind of sense of what the book is like. It is not out yet, so you're getting a little preview of what is to come. It is out on the 28th of May, but pre-orders are open, and please all pre-order it, because it really helps. So before we launch into questions, are you happy for me to start?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay. It's pretty, sexy, so... Introduction, the cool girl and the sex addict. He picked me up in his 4x4, which looked bloated and oversized, humming away on the narrow street as I ran around my bedroom, shoving things into a giant bag. I had that heavy sense of foreboding which always precedes a breakup. You carry your possessions like armor, a therapist once told me, a mechanism through which you try to impose control over your day, a way of dealing with the anxiety of worldly uncertainty by always being overprepared with stuff. Perhaps she was right, I thought, as I shoved 2 cardigans and an extra scarf into a tote, as though this wad of wool might quell my mounting anxiety. A recovered anorexic has to find their control fix somehow. We'd planned to drive to the countryside today, somewhere far away where we could walk and talk for hours. But as I got into the car, he said he'd changed his mind. There wasn't time. He now had to be back before lunch, and besides, it was a grey and overcast day. I nodded in agreement as he suggested we go somewhere closer, thinking this is exactly why our non-relationship must end, because not a single plan nor promise was ever held to, and because he is a sex addict and I'm fueling his addiction. As he drove me home from our half-hearted ramble in a field somewhere off the A1, I grew teary. The situation felt like it demanded it. I felt like I owed the whole affair some sort of final performance, as much for myself as for him. This is what dating was supposed to look and feel like, I told myself. He pulled over to the side of the road and kissed me. A goodbye sort of kiss that turned into a snog, and then suddenly he was pulling his dick out of his trousers, as he so often did, telling me for the umpteenth time just how hard I made him. In the near distance, kids shouted as they kicked a ball across the grass, their parents clapping loudly in support. Someone will see, I told him, throwing my scarf over his lap as he moved his hand up and down. I kissed him again awkwardly, and he moved his hand faster, biting my lip as his eyes clouded over with the determined stare of the deeply aroused. Finally, he let out a satisfied moan before slumping back into his seat, a smile dancing across his wet lips. I rolled my eyes and grabbed the scarf from his lap. A warm patch of damp spread across the area in which he'd come. He restarted the engine, and we returned to the road. If you ever want to have casual, consequenceless sex with someone, he said, eyes fixed on the car plate in front of him, anytime, any day, just call me. I nodded, wondering if sex for me could ever be so devoid of feeling as to be fully without consequence. 10 minutes later, we were back outside my flat. With my cum-soaked scarf bundled into my bag, I said a final goodbye and got out of his car. We had started having sex some 3 or so months ago, a novelty to me because I'd only recently finished seeing a sex therapist and was in the early throes of trying to figure out what kind of relationship to intimacy I now wanted to establish, or rather, what kind of sex did I actually like? These were questions that had long evaded me, since I'd moved through my 20s convinced I was broken. I didn't enjoy sex in the way everyone around me seemed to, and I couldn't orgasm with the frequency or ease with which my friends appeared accustomed. truthfully, I couldn't orgasm at all. But I feigned nonchalance in this area of my life, relishing occasional flings for their quick hit of intimacy, while dreading actually having sex. It's not that I didn't like it per se, or not always, but more that my body's perceived inability to function as expected felt like a blight on my personhood, on my womanhood. Like every girl or woman, I'd perfected the performance of pleasure with aplomb. I knew how to writhe and moan and move my body to a sexual rhythm. I just lost, or perhaps never truly discovered, the ability to enjoy it.
Such a brilliant, brilliant excerpt. Thank you, Em. So your book takes us on this real journey of sexual self-discovery, and it all started for you when you were 28 and you decided to try sex therapy for the first time. So can you share with us a bit about what it was that compelled you to actually try sex therapy and got you in your bedroom, on Zoom, on your laptop, speaking to a woman called Alex in LA about the most intimate parts of your life?
I mean, I should begin by saying I was never someone that spoke about sex growing up. I did not live in some kind of super open, I imagine, like kind of hippie household where sex was, a part of our conversation at the dinner table. I grew up in a very, sex was very much a taboo topic growing up. I remember my only sex conversation with my parents was my mum. When I was 10 years old, I'd made a folder of pictures of Draco Malfoy because I was in love with him. And I presented it to my mum before bed and was like, Mum, I'm in love, and this is who I'm going to marry, and I'm just like so excited. And I just like showed her this like ring binder, and she was just like got really awkward and was like, and then just got up. And as she got to the door, she just goes, and you mustn't have sex until you're 18, and turned out the light and closed the door, and that was it. So like I did not talk about sex growing up, and that we never spoke about it again. So I didn't really think and talk about sex. It wasn't something I was very open about with friends. I just, had a pretty bad relationship to sex since the ending of my first big relationship at about 23. I just stopped being able to orgasm, did not enjoy sex. And prior to that relationship, it had been a similar story. So it had just been this kind of one pocket of time where things had changed. But I was at a dinner party one evening when it was kind of when we were in that period where we were sort of coming out of lockdown. When it was like sort of glitching and you kind of don't know who you are or what you talk about. And I think because I was with a group of near strangers, I felt, I guess, relaxed enough, or for whatever reason, we started talking about sex. And I admitted to this group of women that I was sitting with that actually just like, I just wasn't a sexual person. I didn't enjoy sex. I couldn't orgasm. Some people are sexual, some people aren't. I'm not. End of. And turned out the women on either side of me had recently gone to see the sex therapist, Alex Triculia, and had become absolute evangelicals for the sex therapy cause. And just one of them turned to me and said, you can work on your relationship to sex. This is something that you can actually really fix and make better. And it was kind of, to me, I was like, what? And they both kind of convinced me over the course of this evening that I should, at least give this woman Alex a call. And so I left that dinner party thinking, well, I've got nothing to lose. And then actually got commissioned to write a column about going to sex therapy. And if there's one thing I love, it's a business incentive. And so the next week, I picked up the phone and I booked in my first therapy session with Alex. And prepared to kind of divulge the kind of interior, divulge all my non-sordid sex secrets, because there wasn't much to discuss by way of the sex I was having.
You kind of alluded to it there, but so many of us grew up, I think, in households similar to yours where we just didn't speak about sex. And I think a big part of that is that, we millennials went to schools where sex education amounted to being taught how to put a condom on a banana, and that was it.
Don't have sex and don't get an STI. And then best of luck.
But essentially, that was it. There was no conversation about pleasure. There was also no conversation about consent. And I think that is actually a huge part of this conversation when we talk about pleasure. And you reference it in your book. You speak about how the film How to Have Sex that came out in, I think it was 2023.
Yeah, have you seen that Molly Manning Walker's film? Brilliant film, How to Have Sex. You see it? Yeah, it's phenomenal.
It's brilliant. And you write about the very moving impact that film had on you and how it made you kind of rethink our relationships to our bodies and pleasure as women, and based on, I suppose, those really shameful narratives that we were raised on when we were 16, 17, and the fact that we just were not taught about anything like boundaries, safety, consent. Can you tell us a bit about what that film was about and the impact that it had on you.
Totally. So just for a bit of context, for anyone who hasn't seen it, How to Have Sex by Molly Manning Walker. I won't go through the whole film, but kind of at the crux of this film is this girl who is on a holiday trip. They're just drinking, having fun, like, you know, just kind of wild, kind of post-GCSE holiday. And she is fixated on losing her virginity. I say virginity because I debunk the whole notion of virginity in my book. But she's fixated on having sex and ends up, there's this kind of scene where she is with this guy and has really kind of non-consensual, just, it's kind of a very affronting scene. They're on the beach. She's so visibly uncomfortable. And at one point, he just does not give a shit. And at one point, you just see him like on top of her, and you just see one tear goes down her cheek, and it's so galling. The honest truth, I actually had a whole section on this book that my editor made me cut out, and I think for very good reason. Because when I first saw that film, specifically that scene, I didn't know what to make of it. And my editor made me take it out. She was like, you know, this is gonna open up it's going to make you look like you don't think that was non-consensual, and obviously you do. It was nuanced. But what I meant by that is that scene for me felt so familiar. It was really hard to acknowledge when first writing it that it was sexual assault. And that's even when I'm running sex talks, I have these conversations so much now in the past 5 years. So since doing sex therapy, I've run this platform called Sex Talks because I'm like so obsessed with our cultural discourse around sexuality, pleasure, all these things. And so even though this is so part of my, you know, my conversations, I found that scene confronting because I was watching it with my best friend and I was like, well, you know, she did kind of did she want it? And I kind of had to really kind of check myself after that because, yeah, it was uncomfortable to acknowledge. It was so obviously sexual assault, but to acknowledge that, and both me and my best friend said it, is to have to reconcile with how many of our sexual experiences had been non-consensual, had been violations, because they had really closely mirrored that situation where, you know, we have this idea that, you know, sexual assault of any requires, no, get off, like screaming, shouting, being pushed up in the alleyway. And of course it's not. Like, if you're visibly uncomfortable, if you're stiff in your body, if you're not consenting vocally, if you're not participating with your body, you don't want it. That's not okay. So it really, that whole film for me was so confronting in so many ways. And I think it just really addressed that question so well. And I think because the thing I really took from that kind of thereafter was, because our sex education is generally so crap, and mine really was just, was actually the first thing of our sex education was a film of a woman giving birth, and we just saw the head coming out of the vagina, and we were all like, oh my God.
Me too.
No precursor, just like, this is it. This is what happens if you have sex. And we were all like clutching our vulvas like, fuck me, or don't ever fuck me. In fact, life of chastity beckons. But I think because this very kind of scary narrative is created around sex. It's, that kind of Coach Carr in Mean Girls, like, don't have sex, you will get chlamydia and you will die. And I think what this does, when there is a complete absence of pleasure in conversations around sex, it establishes such a low bar for our expectations of sex growing up, I think particularly as women, because I do think we still have a very kind of male-centric sexual economy that is perpetuated through culture and films and everything. We don't really have time to go into that, but we can do another day. But I think because of that, our bar is so low. And like growing up, pleasure and sex, like what? Pleasure wasn't really part of my lexicon. Yeah. I didn't go into sex thinking like this is going to be something that could be pleasurable for me. It was something I thought was kind of, I had to perform my pleasure for someone else's enjoyment and to make them come. And I think what that film it showed the nuances of consent, because when you are not taught about pleasure and about kind of how to even understand, navigate, communicate the boundaries of your body, like, what does consent even mean? We're not even taught how to express boundaries. And so I think that film was a very nuanced, really important exploration of that.
I think as girls, you're kind of taught, okay, sex is something that men do to you. and that is it. That's the start and the end. And I feel like our whole adult life has been about unlearning that step by step.
And it was always kind of like, it's something that's done to you, and it's kind of it's your decision. You're kind of either going along with it or you're pushing the person off. And then it's like, am I Madonna versus whore complex? Like, am I a prude if I say no? Am I, an absolute slut if I go ahead and do it? It's just so loaded. It's so difficult, I think, navigating sex growing up. And then, of course, that lays the foundations. These adolescent experiences. I just wrote an article about it this week for the book. Prior to that, one first formative relationship from like 18 to 23, my sexual experiences were so, a lot of them not consensual. A lot of them were, with lots of drink and drugs, very pressurized with much older men. There was just experiences that I didn't know how to say no was the main thing, because I didn't think I could. I thought that like my job as a woman, or my kind of duty, was to make sure that if I was with someone, I had to like please them. And so I think that we need to set the bar a hell of a lot higher, because I think when you're expecting pleasure from sex, when you feel comfortable, when you know your yes, so you know what feels good, you know what you want, and you also feel comfortable saying no, you're just in such a much stronger position for having sex. It isn't just consensual, which also is a low bar, but is mutually pleasurable.
Yeah, enthusiastic consent is what we should all be striving towards. Another thing that you write about really movingly in the book is your relationship with your body, and particularly your relationship with your body growing up. And again, that goes back to the point about adolescence and how that shapes our view on sex and pleasure as an adult. But you write very, very candidly about this eating disorder that you had when you were younger, and I would love to know a bit more about how you dealt with that as you got older, and also how that hindered your relationship to sexual pleasure, because you explain it in a way that I think is very unique, and something that a lot of people who haven't dealt with those issues won't have thought about before.
So one of the first things, when I went into sex therapy, I thought she would just tell me like, okay, here's a great vibrator, good luck, have some fun, and kind of just set me kind of masturbatory homework. Which, listen, I was like, cool, a bit different. Of course, that's not where sex therapy begins. One of the first things my sex therapist asked me was about my relationship to my body. And I had grown up like so many young women with an eating disorder. I was anorexic from kind of 13 to 15, and then kind of bulimic, took loads of laxative, just the whole, was just so at war with my body. I think the stats are that like, I think 700,000 women in the UK have eating disorders, although that stat is going to be so much higher in reality because so many are underreported. So I grew up feeling at war with my body. And even when I got physically better at 15, and that was an amalgamation of kind of pressure from my school, parents and everything, I never really made peace with my body. And I kind of went through those kind of ensuing years just still kind of using bulimia as my kind of crutch for anxiety. But I never really connected that feeling of body enmity with the issues I had around sex and with my perceived inability to enjoy sex. So when I stopped being able to orgasm at 23, and then for those kind of years until I went to sex therapy, those also were years in which my bulimia got much worse, and it became, particularly during the pandemic, as anyone with a mental health issue knows so well, it was such a chaotic time. And it just, for me, it was kind of that, my way of grappling with that was to just turn in on myself, to kind of be self-abusive. That's kind of how I regained control over what felt like, uncontrollable situations. But I hadn't made this connection, which is kind of wild to me now, because of course we have sex in our bodies. And if you struggle to be in your body in a kind of peaceful, joyful way, if you don't allow yourself to experience pleasure on a day-to-day basis, then it's of course going to be really hard to experience sexual pleasure in the context of intimacy, where also the stakes feel a lot higher. Like you're with someone else. There's, it feels much more kind of high pressure. But I think it was like session number 2. I told my therapist, and I really did not tell anyone. I felt like these issues around sex and the eating disorder were these kind of twin pillars of shame that I kind of carried in my back pocket, and that I just didn't. I thought if I just keep them back, I don't need to acknowledge them. I can just kind of like have this separation in my life. But of course that, you know, it trickles into all aspects of your life. But I think it was in session number 2, my therapist said to me, for as long as you are at war with your body, you are going to struggle to enjoy sexual pleasure. And it was the first time I made that connection between my issues with my body and my connection to sex. And it was the first time something genuinely shifted, because it gave me just a new perspective on my body. And I was like, oh, so me having these kind of this, being so self-abusive in my relationship to my body is actually having a huge knock-on effect on this other aspect of my life, on my capacity to intimacy. And, you know, it's not like that one thing changed everything, but it really set in motion. I think in the following sessions that we did together, I think the kind of really big learning from sex therapy for me was learning how to look after myself, how to live in some sort of communion with my body. So kind of putting down my weapons of war and just learning to make peace with my body. And that was a huge part of, like, you know, the practice. She did eventually set me masturbatory practices, FYI. Obviously, it was sex therapy. But, you know, early on, it was like, you could just ask me to just be with my body, just lie down and just kind of touch parts of my body and try not to have this hateful narrative that had really typified how I spoke to my body and thought of myself.
It's about safety as well, isn't it? Because, like, if you don't feel safe in your own body, then how are you going to feel safe at the hands of someone else's body, you know? And it's obviously, if you don't feel safe, then you're not going to experience any kind of pleasure. So it's about so much more than just confidence. I think it often gets reduced to just body confidence, and it's like, no, it's a much deeper issue than that.
That's actually such a good way of describing it. It's body safety, because so much about, like, good sex is having emotional safety and being able to feel at ease in a very intimate context. And you're right, if you don't have the capacity to do that when you're alone, so just in your own company, it's kind of almost impossible to have that with someone else.
Let's talk a bit about modern dating, which is in desperate need of some good PR. You write about your habit in the book of collecting WhatsApp boyfriends. It's one of my favorite parts of the book. You have this anecdote about this guy who called himself a maverick, a Kubrick kid, and he then ended things, and later you received a travel book to Rome that he'd sent you with a note saying, "You'll be needing this, M." And to me, it's kind of the perfect encapsulation of how so much of dating today is based on these fantastical projections and these kind of digital first relationships that can exist largely in our own heads for a long time. So I guess I want to ask you a bit more about what you learned from those sort of situationships and how you think they are holding us back from finding real meaningful love.
Oh, the WhatsApp boyfriend. I don't know if anyone here has collected a few WhatsApp boyfriends, but I had a really good stint for about 8 years. Yeah. So I think so much of... so to kind of go back a few steps on the WhatsApp boyfriend, I think a lot of it really started... intensified during the pandemic when we were all kind of just forced to be on our phones the whole time. But I really just developed this habit of having these really intense kind of pseudo relationships with people on my phone. So I meet people on a dating app and we'd get to talk, we'd go really deep in our just texting and, you know, whatever. But to the point where, like, I'm talking like hour-long voice notes, sometimes some phone calls, or sometimes just like non-stop.
But they're really hour-long voice notes.
There was one guy at a certain point where we left each other like a 1 to 1.5 hour voice note each week that basically served like a Catholic confessional, because we would just tell each other all our most, like, he told me his kinks, he told me his like fantasies, like we went deep. Honestly, I think there was this is, and that's kind of the thing, because this technology creates this sense of this kind of veil. You feel like there's this barrier between you. It's like being in a confessional box. You have this kind of barrier between you two that you can just kind of say anything. And I think it creates this sense of intensity. And also just the amount of messaging that I was able to have with these people, and it really continued for a long time. But just this constant exchange of messages, and, you know, even then being, you know, seeing them on social media and then messaging on WhatsApp, and there's just so many kind of forms of digital communication that create you in this constant contact. It's like having kind of a boyfriend in your pocket, which creates this sense of extreme intimacy, but devoid of any kind of human touch or humanness. anonymous. And so I think for a long time, I really grew very accustomed to being camped out in this kind of digital field where I was able to have this intense kind of pseudo-intimacy that didn't actually have any kind of real life bearing. And oftentimes, like that example that you highlighted there, was a really good example because that guy, like we kind of fell for one another in this really intense way over these phone calls. We had like a 4-hour phone call once. I mean, I think I had too much time, like, I don't know. But he, and then we kind of just spoke for weeks. Eventually we met, and it was just totally disappointing because in real life we weren't the person that we'd projected. And
he wasn't a maverick.
He was no maverick, honey. Oh my God, he was as far from a maverick as you could be. He also like wanted to have a nap in the middle of a date, which was also there were many things that also went wrong. I brought my best friend on this date. It was like there were many. You have to read the book to find out, but this was like. I also take some ownership. As I said, that was like post-pandemic. We were fucking glitching. Like, life was weird, I was weird. But I think there was, and I think part of that was also reflected in, that probably like kind of fear of physical intimacy, where this kind of the digital alternative gave me a kind of space to escape to that was safe and was non-intimate in a personal way, but allowed me to kind of satisfy my desire for emotional connection. But of course, I think over the many years, kind of falling in love with these like digital avatars in my head, ultimately it proves quite unsatisfying. And I think it really changed. In retrospect, I think it really made me... I just think there's a lot, as we know, there's a lot wrong, I think, with our overdependence on digital communication and technology in dating when it comes to love. And I ended up meeting my now boyfriend in the gym, in person, actually 2 weeks after getting my book deal. So it felt like quite a kind of, decisive, definitive kind of moment in time. And what I loved is that we never spent much time camped out in any digital forum. We were just speaking in person. An absolute novelty, but one that really, you meet someone, you meet someone in their wholeness with all their imperfections. And I think a lot of digital dating kind of really takes away a lot of that.
It brings me on to my last question before we move on to the anonymous Q&A. But I think the book has such a lovely arc to it where we really follow you on this trajectory of learning about your body and yourself. And then, like you said, the book concludes with you meeting your lovely partner. And I guess I'm curious from a writer's perspective, how did you go about structuring that? And did you kind of, because you were writing about a lot of this stuff as you were experiencing it too. So when you went into it, did you kind of have that arc in mind, or did it kind of organically form as you were writing the book?
So the book I proposed to my editor, so the book I got commissioned is not the book I wrote. I pitched a book that was diagnosing why our broader sex culture is broken and how we fix it. I wanted to write a really kind of probably academic feminist book. And then as I was working on the proposal with my agent and then kind of just in the early stages of writing it, I just felt the books that I love and gravitate to are books that are story-led, or kind of like John Ronson's my like absolute literary hero, of someone who is just, you are in the story with him, and it's, show don't tell, right? That's what it is. And my agent was always saying kind of, it's the memoir element that really kind of sings and allows us to really kind of move with you and, experience what you're talking about in a really powerful way. And I was always kind of resistant to that at first, because I probably had a bit of a dismissive view of memoir. And I was like, who wants to read a memoir by a 33-year-old? Like, fuck that. And then actually those were the kind of the memoir stories were the bits that were so evocative in the writing. I've rewritten this book 3 times, genuinely, because I did have to kind of get rid of my own biases and pieces of resistance to kind of that memoir stuff, and really lean into the stories and kind of allow them to be allow my own story to be the vehicle that takes us through as it takes through kind of the narrative after the book. The first half of the book kind of looks back and is more kind of diagnosing like how I felt why I became broken in my relationship to sex, and looking at our broader sex culture and how I think it fucks us up. Taking you through the sex therapy room, so it kind of goes personal and then it goes out and looks at our broader society. The final section of the book, as you said, kind of the stories happened as I was writing. And I was quite resistant to writing about anything that was happening in situ, because I always think you need a bit of distance from what you're writing about. Otherwise, it can feel a little bit like you're processing on the page. And I don't personally love that much. However, meeting my boyfriend, falling in love, and then getting pregnant while writing a book about pleasure, I couldn't not write about that, because it just brought to the fore so much of what I was writing and thinking about. I got accidentally pregnant, and in the same week that I got pregnant, there was a bill that was put forward in the US in South Carolina that would make getting an abortion punishable by death for women there. And so I was kind of just, so I was writing about pleasure, accidentally pregnant, on the phone to doctors trying to get an abortion, and I was like, none of this matters if women don't have bodily autonomy. There's no point in us having conversations about pleasurable sex if women don't have the right to control their body, don't have choice over their body. And, I wanted to write about, falling in love in the mundanity of the day-to-day, as opposed to like in the kind of pseudo-intimacy of online spaces. But I didn't want to end the book on and then I met my knight in shining armor and it was all fabulous. Because it wasn't. I fell pregnant. I had to get an abortion all while writing about this stuff. Also in a week when I was doing these ads for a condom company being like, condoms are the best way of avoiding accidental pregnancy. And I was like, you don't fucking say. So it was also, I couldn't have predicted that any of that would happen in this process. But I'm, in a way, kind of grateful it did, both the highs and the lows, because I also got to explore love and intimacy in a very kind of raw, real way. In that, yes, I fell in love and it was fucking amazing and fabulous, but it's also really hard, and there were so many things that came with that, which again, all kind of highlighted lots of other points I was talking about. Timing, yes. So yes, that was that.
Well, it is a very beautiful book, and thank you for writing it, because I think it is going to help so many women. So congratulations to you.